Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Charlie Melcher. I'm the founder of the Future of Storytelling Summit, and you're here today with us for our virtual roundtable conversation with Dr. Paul Zak. We're very honored to have you with us here today. Dr. Paul Zak is one of the leading experts in the field of neuroeconomics. He has written an amazing book called The Moral Molecule, and he's the founding director of the Center of Neuroeconomic Studies at Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California. Welcome. We're glad to have you here with us today, Dr. Paul Zak.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Great to be here.
So for those of you who haven't joined us before, this is our weekly gathering of the amazing speakers who came to the Future of Storytelling Summit, which was held this last October. And we have a different speaker come each week to join us for a casual roundtable conversation on their field of expertise. If you are watching us from the world of Google Plus or YouTube, please feel free to join the conversation by sending us any questions, texting us any questions, and we'll try to make sure your question gets shared with the group. So now why don't we go around the table and have everyone introduce themselves. Frank, why don't you start?
Sure. My name is Frank Rose. I'm the author of The Art of Immersion, which is a book about how the internet is changing storytelling.
Great to have you with us, Frank, and also a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Martha, why don't you say hi?
Hi, I'm Marta Gabriel from Brazil. I am also an author of the book Marketing in Digital Age, and I'm writing a new one on education, the impacts of technology on education. So storytelling is great for that also.
Welcome. Glad to have you with us.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And Bill?
Thanks very much, Charlie. I'm Bill Casebeer. I'm a program manager at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where I both accomplish and fund work in the neurobiology and psychology of narrative and storytelling.
So I should mention that Bill and Paul sort of shared the speaking role at the Future of Storytelling Summit this year. The film that we did beforehand, which is a wonderful film, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely go to futureofstorytelling.org and watch this short film that was created by Kirby Ferguson. And it stars Paul Zak and his work. But then actually at the summit came Bill Casebeer in his place and led the roundtable conversation there. So we actually kind of have a 2-for-1 today. So glad to have you both here. So Paul, I'd love it if you would start us off by telling a little bit about the research that you've done that went into the book, The Moral Molecule.
Thanks, Charlie. So about a dozen years ago, I became sort of obsessed with this question, that humans haven't thought about much over time, which is the nature of good and evil. And I thought, much of the things we see in the world are good. We see people who are kind to each other, who help each other, and we really didn't have a good understanding of why that happened. We have sort of general evolutionary stories of, why cooperation will build your reputation. But I'm a very practical person, so I was looking for direct physiologic mechanisms to understand why people would ever, help a stranger, for example. And so I studied the animal literature and found this molecule oxytocin, which mammals make and motivates care for offspring. I started thinking, gee, care for offspring and helping strangers, maybe that runs in a continuum. So we started running these experiments in which we measure oxytocin in blood. We would have stimuli that would induce the release of oxytocin, we thought, and then after that stimulus, we saw what happened to these humans. And we found over a dozen years of experiments that we could induce the brain to release oxytocin, and all of a sudden people would connect to each other. They would care about each other. So oxytocin seems to be this kind of safety signal that the human brain has, and it's much more powerful in humans than other mammals, and it's consistent with our kind of hypersocial nature. Not only do we not fear being around strangers, we actually look forward to it. We like living in big cities like New York and Washington and LA. It's really fun for us to be around strangers. And so to do that, we have to have something in our heads that says, Charlie, great guy, I want to be around him, and Frank, clearly a sketchy person, right? So I want to avoid Frank at all costs. No, I'm kidding. Frank's great too. So we have this mechanism, and so we started sort of pushing on this mechanism harder and harder. We can actually manipulate oxytocin pharmacologically in the human brain safely, and we found that it works more or less as a sort of moral molecule. When we release oxytocin, we feel connected and close to each other, and we treat each other well in very tangible ways, say giving each other money. Okay, so we're doing this work, and one of the key questions is, gee, what's the subjective experience of your brain releasing oxytocin? So a graduate student, now a faculty member of my lab, George Barraza, developed this little video that he got with permission from St. Jude Children's Hospital of a father talking about his son, and the son is a 2-year-old boy, Ben, who's dying of brain cancer. And St. Jude's has extended his life, but like most brain cancers, there's only a short window in which you can actually, kind of maintain your health before the cancer takes over. It's a very powerful video. It's 100 seconds. It's our strongest and most reliable oxytocin releaser. And what we found was that this narrative, this story had a classical narrative structure. So the story starts with the father talking to the camera about how it's been difficult, how he's been working very hard to enjoy his son, and then we pan to the son. We see this little boy who's bald, who's happy, but he obviously looks sick. And then the tension in the story is that the father is trying to enjoy the little boy's last months. The little boy doesn't know he's dying. He's 2, right? He's just happy he's not throwing up because he's, done with chemo. And so it's a very powerful story. People cry. And what we found was that the release of oxytocin was associated with a sense of empathy. So once you connected to these characters emotionally, then all of a sudden, because we're always skeptics about what people tell us, people who release oxytocin donated money to childhood cancer. And we did another experiment where they watched this movie and then they donated money to people in the lab. And so we found that this sense of connection, which is developed through story, is an important way to bring people together and essentially transports us into other people's worlds. So how do we know this? We used a control video in which we had the same father and son for 100 seconds at the zoo where they're walking around looking at animals. And guess what? No tension, no release of tension, no oxytocin release. In fact, the tension goes down. So we actually sort of cap this off, and I'll let everyone else jump in. We actually have a paper coming out in press today where we looked at public service ads. And public service ads that have this same kind of narrative structure, dramatic arc, if they capture your attention and they induce the release of oxytocin, you're connecting to the characters in the story. We see an increase in donations to those charities when those ads have that structure. So it looks like this classical dramatic arc story structure has stuck around for so long. This is not new information, but it resonates with our own physiology, in particular with this sense of oxytocin release, which motivates us to engage in costly action. And I think that's really interesting. So now we have not only an understanding of why stories are so compelling, why we're sad, when the hero dies, or why we cry when the guy gets the girl in the movie, but we also know that stories can change our behavior by changing our brain chemistry.
It's amazing research. So you've actually found the chemicals that are associated with what makes a story.
That's right, and I should say there's a bunch of other chemicals involved, and we're currently doing a lot more work with funding from Bill's agency at DARPA to really understand how to craft different narrative elements so that we can understand which of those elements really grab onto these neurochemicals. And we see it's reflected in things like heart rate and skin conductance. And so skin conductance, sweating in the palms, is a good signal of arousal. I'm really paying attention to this story. I'm focused on it. It's really important to me. That's number one. I've got to get your attention. But number two is I've got to suck you into the story. I've got to make it relevant for you. If it doesn't resonate with your own physiology, which we've shown, even though the story may be very compelling, it doesn't work for me. So we could talk later, for example, about horror movies, which is its own little genre with a separate demographic that's kind of distinct from everybody else. But when it resonates with me and it got my attention and I get this oxytocin release, all of a sudden I am part of the story. And I think that cognitive process, which is probably uniquely human, is just an amazing ability.
So one of the things that comes to my mind immediately when I hear this is the application for storytellers. I mean, do you feel now that you can be a script doctor?
That's a great question. Having spent 4 years writing my first book, which came out last May, I certainly learned a lot. But yeah, this work has actually affected the way I give public lectures, TED Talks. It's affected the way I teach. It's impacted how I interact with people all around the globe and write. And so I think it's having that kind of structure. I don't think I'm ready for strict doctor, jobs yet, but I think to be an effective communicator of information, this is like Marshall McLuhan, right? The medium is the meshes. I've got to have this very rich medium. And we could talk more about the work we've done and other labs have done on how to build up highly compelling stories using sensory tags.
So just so I understand, a sensory tag is like a physiological response? No, tell me again what a sensory tag is.
That's right. I'm sorry for using a jargony word. So yeah, a physiologic association with that story. So it could be the sweating of the palms, but it could be smell. So I could tell you a story where the hero passes a room and has some unusual smell, and I can do that writing. I can do it in film as well, right? I can pan across and just slowly focus on the nose and then move across. I can do it in a very subtle way, but the more associational hooks I have, and particularly these hooks that draw on our five senses, the more I'll remember the story, the more its physiologic signature affects my own body chemistry, and that sucks me into the story more strongly.
I would imagine that your work would be very sought after by people in the pervasive arts, the advertising community, would be very curious to understand a little more deeply how they can make stories that motivate action.
It's true. So we've had some discussions with people in the advertising industry of ads that are just so compelling, sometimes ads that just work on branding, don't try to sell a product. Honestly, what we don't know is if you don't like chocolate and I have you watch a really compelling narrative about chocolate, can I change your preferences? My sense is I can't. I might be able to really suck you into the story. So, the sort of classic example would be, I don't know, Coors beer. So you put girls in bikinis in that ad, I'm going to watch it, right? Because I'm a guy and that's, part of my wiring. Will I switch beer brands? Probably not, because I don't really like Coors and I don't drink beer that often anyway. So, so there's a difference between getting attention, which I think most advertising is focused on, and generating a change in action. And so that attention and generating desire for the product are different than actually moving you into purchasing that. So we focused on public service ads and ads where there's a donation decision, because then I have an objective measure that you've really been changed. So if you just say, oh, ad's super compelling, how do I know, right? I mean, it could be that you're just saying that because I'm the researcher and you want to make me happy. But if we're paying you $40 for the experiment and you give 10 to childhood cancer charity, yeah, I think I probably changed your attitude and your behavior. So that's the direction we're working now. And we're really taking this out. We look at cross-cultural effects and even things when people tell stories. You see a lot of mimicking of behavior. So Charlie, you're a very empathic person, I can tell, because you have good eye contact with me. You're doing mimicking behaviors, you're nodding, all these things telling me that we're engaging well together. You have a nice smile, and so this makes me want to keep talking to you, as opposed to a blank stare, flat, nothing happening. So we're looking at these gestural effects, not only in videos, but in real life interaction. So how this mimicking of gestures tells us that, hey, I want to keep interacting with this person, and then at some point maybe that person influences my my attitudes.
So there are certain types of stories, kind of the classic idea that maybe there are 5 or 7 basic story patterns. The hero's journey, for example, or the revenge story, or the stranger in a strange land story. Have you looked at this in terms of effectiveness, in terms of what causes this kind of reaction?
Looks like we just lost Paul.
Right.
So
It wasn't something I said.
Yeah. You needed to be more empathetic
I guess so.
you spoke to him. You created some response, but it just was a negative one here. Paul, are you back?
I'm back. Yeah, it was such a good question. I got knocked off the internet.
Frank, why don't you ask it
Could
again?
you
I'm not
repeat
sure
that?
Paul caught the answer.
Sure, sure. So, there's this sort of classic meme of an idea that there are, 5 or 7 basic types of stories that exist in the world, and that, pretty much every story conforms to one of these models. So, the stranger in a strange land story, the hero's journey story, the revenge story. I'm wondering if you've looked at stories in this context in terms of which of these models might be most effective in arousing empathy.
That's a great question, and in fact, that's the work that Bill, with a multidisciplinary team, is working on now. Is what are those specific elements and story types? And so, I guess from the kind of Homeland Security perspective, we're always telling stories. Our president tells us stories. The Congress tells us stories. And so some of those stories are revenge stories. Some of those are heroic stories. And if we want to be effective communicators, then we want to know which of those stories really resonates with us and which don't. And again, I think the answer is less, the heroic journey story always works versus when I'm in a point in which I'm ready for that. My own physiologic state prepares me for that based on my history, the environment I'm in, then different story types will resonate different ways. So think of when you first saw, Rocky 1, right? You're like, I'm going to go work out. This is fabulous, And then, by Rocky 7, you're like, whatever. Some old guy beating up a Russian. And so, because it was a different time. You felt differently. Maybe you were younger. I was younger. So there's a lot of contingencies here, and I think that's what we don't understand well. I think, Charlie, this is where it really brings back into effective storytelling, the future of storytelling, is that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. It's really going to be thinking of contingency. So we've thought of, instead of segmenting the population based on, say, demographics or gender, there might be a physiologic segmentation. If I can get a quick read on your physiologic state, I may be able to craft a more effective narrative for you, knowing how you're feeling right now. And if I just ask you how you're feeling, most of that's unconscious. You might not be able to tell me, but we're investigating ways where we can get a quick read, for example, on face microexpressions, get a quick read on where you are, in your own physical state, and then adjust the story to affect that. Wouldn't that be great?
It would.
I actually think a lot about that because of what the advances that are taking place these days in gaming technologies. So, for example, the Kinect for Xbox, it's rumored that the next version is going to be so precise that it's going to be able to pick up your facial expressions and changes of intonation in your voice. So if you couple that technology with the research you're doing, Paul, are you suggesting that or the story might change depending on how it reads your emotion, your response to it?
Yeah, I think so. I think, like good, rich video games, World of Warcraft and others, where you can choose your own story, that story should modulate where we're at, and it should also measure, if possible, if you have these sensors, measure how I'm responding to that story, and then start doing little tweaks so that it's actually more fun for me or more compelling. I think, for listeners, the first thing you'll think of is, oh my gosh, now advertisers are going to have to somehow get a read on me, and they're going to be able to manipulate me. So I'm less worried about that. I mean, I think we should have that discussion, we as a society. But what we found is in all these experiments, we still have this nice executive part of our brain, the front of the brain, which allows us to plan and make decisions. And, we do experiments where we, for example, shoot oxytocin into people's brains safely through the nose. I mean, I've done hundreds and hundreds of these experiments. And there are, 20% of people who don't respond. And usually they're slow. So if you watch how long it takes them to decide about something, they're really slow. So they're sort of processing this and thinking, oh, I'm getting this unconscious signal from oxytocin saying everything's safe, treat this guy nicely, but, I got $40 in my hand and my student loan is late and whatever. I'm going to suppress that sort of signal that my brain's giving me about this kind of positive interaction. So again, we're still processing this, and until we, go and put electrodes in people's brains and, tweak them by like rats, I think people still have a lot of choice involved. So even though in these experiments we can explain, 40 to 50% of the variation of how much people donate to charity, having watched an ad, we can't explain 100%. So there's still, half the variation that's based on genetics, history, tiredness, stress, lots of other things that we just haven't been able to really pick out yet. And just randomness, sometimes seeing the, highly emotional, dramatic, moody works for me, and sometimes it doesn't. And we're not sure why. And that's actually beautiful, right? It means we have this underlying sense of kind of free will and randomness in the world, and we'll never really nail things down perfectly because the brain itself has this irreducible randomness in it. So I'm not worried about manipulation, although other people may be, and we should, I think, think about it a little bit.
So I'm interested just to quickly ask you about this idea that you shoot oxytocin into people through, I guess, through the nose. Are you thinking that you could develop something that would make people more receptive to stories? I mean, is this like going to replace butter on the popcorn at the theater? You're going to spray some oxytocin
Spritz it in the theater, right. So, Charlie, you know me. I'm about hugs and not drugs. And so we show touch releases oxytocin, so I hug everybody. No, I mean, certainly that would clearly be unethical if I'm going to pharmacologically manipulate you. So we spray oxytocin into people to show the direct causal relationship between oxytocin and this positive social behavior. So, for example, in this paper we have coming out today on public service ads, in one of the experiments, we gave people oxytocin or placebo, had them watch these 16 public service ads, and the people on oxytocin were more engaged with the characters in the ads, donated to about 50% more ads, and donated 50% more money. So the oxytocin has this causal relationship on me being drawn into the narrative of this ad. And then we showed that, we took one ad and we showed that when it's really compelling, if you pay attention, and we can see that physiologically, and if you release oxytocin, you have this empathic response to the characters in the ad, then you're very likely to donate to charity. I mean, highly likely, 70+%. So the oxytocin infusion is just to show that we've got the right pathway in the brain, because the brain's complicated, all these nonlinear relationships. So hugs, not drugs.
And may I ask you something about education? Oxytocin always gives you the sense of empathy and wants to be more collaborative. And how does it can help in education? Good stories from professors or in classroom could help to improve the level of engagement of students. Is it possible to connect these things?
That's a great question. So I think some of the most innovative educational endeavors like Khan Academy and TED Ed have used stories to put context around different findings. For example, in science, I think it's very important for students to know why some technique or some finding was developed, right? What was the person who found this doing? What were they trying to understand? And then when they go and try to use it, perhaps for a different purpose, at least they understand that it wasn't, pulled out of the air or, dropped from heaven, that someone was working on a problem. And so I think having context and having putting education at human scale, so it's not like, here's tool 1, here's tool 2, here's tool 3, but here's a problem someone faced, and they developed this tool, and now we can use this tool for all of other kinds of things. And just having that short introduction, which I think a lot of educators don't do, is just today we're going to do long division or something, as opposed to hey, and I'm making this up now, but in the ancient Arab world, they had to divide up different bushels of commodities, and it was really hard to do, and they used these little tools, and all of a sudden some guy developed long division, and now we use it all the time today, and it's in calculators. We're going to teach you how to do it on a piece of paper. Something simple so that you have, oh, yeah, this is a problem-solving technique, and I think that's what education can be, is I'm going to solve a problem for you.
So I'm curious about something something else that relates to empathy, which is, about 20 years ago at the University of Parma, quite by accident, a bunch of neuroscientists discovered what they termed mirror neurons. The idea that being that as we watch something happen to somebody else, the part of our brain lit up that would the same part of our brain lit up that would do so if it were happening to us. And this was, you know, as far as I know, sort of the first neuroscientific explanation of empathy. And so I'm curious how oxytocin relates to that.
Great question, Frank. Thank you. I think the mirror neuron story has been overblown. It's an example of wonderful marketing of a potentially very small finding. And my colleagues may say the same thing about me. Oh, you've overblown the oxytocin work. Perhaps. So certainly there's very strong evidence in animals and humans that when we see another animal or member of our species do something volitionally, then we start to activate circuits in the brain that allow us to simulate what they're doing. And that's, particularly for social creatures, that's very effective. Now, does that extend down to an emotional feeling? There's some evidence in humans suggesting it does. Mark Iacoboni, my neighbor at UCLA, has done tons of work on this, wrote a very nice book called Mirroring People that people can read and decide for themselves whether it's compelling or not. In my view, having this kind of motor representation that we find in monkeys is different than having this emotional resonance. I think Marco would say it's all part of the same system. I think the evidence is not so clear there. Having said all that, that's all caveat, right? Having said that, humans are extraordinarily good at mirroring others' emotions, feelings, and that allows us to predict what they're likely to do. And actually, that's one of the great things about storytelling, right, is you want to set up a storyline and then, boop, change it, and then bring it back, right? And so what we find in experiments, not in my lab, other labs, is that change in the story structure, that change at hook, or that change in direction, is really compelling to the brain. So it activates reward areas of the brain, and we like to be fooled a little bit. Now, if it's doing this the whole time, it's, you know, it's then you'd lose it, right? You know, I've lost the structure. Right. But once in a while, I'm going this path, and I change course. The brain loves that, and so Frank, you're a beautiful writer. You know this, but all writers know this. You know this. You know, if I'm always, it's a story arc, right? I want to have a story arc with a couple little hooks in it. I want to do it in a straight line.
Right.
Straight line is too predictable. So there's something nice about being unpredictable and having this kind of surprise that keeps my attention. And I think this is also why in great books, and then, you know, relieves that tension. But also in great books, you see these multiple threads. So, you know, you'll see this thread start and then just stop, and this thread gets picked up, and then this thread's running, and this one, and they all get woven together at the end, hopefully, if, you know, for a good book. But again, it's an amazing cognitive task that we can stop this thread, maintain for the couple of weeks I'm reading this book where this thread stops, and then follow another thread for a while, and then pick up this thread again. And so, you know, we really like that. So, you know, the highly predictable story, and that was my control video of this little father and son. We don't care. Nothing happens. So some unpredictability, some tension is very important, and it activates all these areas of the brain: reward, empathy, and so twists and turns, very nice. And is that part of the mirror neuron system or oxytocin? They're probably all part of some larger brain circuit that we're just now kind of getting little pieces of. So, right. Yeah, fabulous question.
Hey, Bill, we haven't heard from you. Tell us a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, Charlie. Thanks. And so just to complement Paul's answer to Frank's.
Are you there, Bill?
I think we might be having some connectivity issues here. Am I coming through?
Yeah.
Okay, great. The last part of your question got chopped off there, Charlie. So let me wrap back around to that by jumping into this conversation that Frank and Paul were having about mirror neurons, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Please.
So whether or not mirror neurons exist as a class, and there's a lot of controversy in the professional neuroscience community about whether they do. They're called spindle neurons because they have this long fiber-like shape with hairy ends that let them innervate lots of parts of the brain. Whether or not those exist, there is a fair amount of agreement that there is a capacity that our brains possess called theory of mind that's critically important for helping us understand the mental states of others. Now, there's some controversy about whether or not being able to know what's going on in somebody else's head necessarily means that you empathize with them, right? So we might be able to disentangle our ability to make inferences about somebody else's intention from our ability to find their goals to be praiseworthy or our ability to share in their pain. So I will say that in addition to Paul's work that we've been funding, we also have a straightforward theory of mind lab headed by Dr. Rebecca Sachs at MIT at work on the problem of how stories influence theory of mind mechanisms. And they do have one very interesting finding among many, and that is that if you take a story that follows a classical story structure, so setup, climax, and resolution, like Paul talked about in his video, and then you scramble that story so that it is no longer coherent from the perspective of the viewer, then you actually depress activation in some of the brain regions that are affiliated with theory of mind. So what this means is that at least part of what stories do for us is they provide a conduit into the mental world that someone else inhabits. And moreover, I can get a quantitative measure of how much of the conduit they provide by looking at some of these brain areas that are activated whenever coherent stories are transmitted effectively to an intended audience. Charlie, back over to you.
Wow. So I did want to pick up on that and ask you, Bill, are you using the goal of the research that you're helping to fund now and the intention of it being done through DARPA? Is this to help be able to understand better how to explain or sort of win hearts and minds? And I'm just so curious as to why DARPA is investing in the neuroscience of storytelling.
Yeah, that's a great question, Charlie. And it's because we know that narratives and stories have a very powerful impact on lots of aspects of human psychology. So in addition to influencing our ability to inhabit someone else's mental world, they likely influence our ability to empathize with others. We know that they influence our ability to remember events and hence can have lots of downstream effects on the types of judgments and decisions we make about things. And it may very well be that stories and narratives are important for helping us develop dispositions that shape the way we react to the world. So given that stories are very important psychologically, they play a lot of roles in national security as a result. So think about somebody who's being told a particular narrative. Perhaps that narrative is one that Sheikh Hussein Nasrallah, the spiritual leader of the militant wing of Lebanese Hezbollah, might tell to a disaffected Palestinian to get them perhaps to donate money to militant Hezbollah's cause. That's a story that we need to understand. We need to understand how we can tell when that story is being told. We need to understand how we might be able to shape the environment so that that radicalizing story, that story that's motivating someone to donate money to a cause to support the intentional killing of innocent people, a terrorist cause in other words, we need to understand how we can shape the environment so as to make that story less compelling for those people who might otherwise be influenced by it. And so if we look across the span of issues that we're concerned about in the national security domain, everything from counterterrorism, counterinsurgency strategy, where the attitudes and opinions of key stakeholders in the conflict ecology or environment are important, on up to strategic negotiations that happen in a security domain are all shot through the stories. So understanding that process so that we can defend ourselves against exploitation from people who want to use the power of storytelling to harm innocent people or otherwise cause bad consequences for the world is part of the reason why DARPA is investing in the storytelling space.
Makes a lot of sense. And now I certainly understand why you've been supporting Paul Zak because of his approach to hugs being so important. Hugs, not drugs. Um, sorry. So, Paul, we have a question from one of our viewers. They asked us about how they could find the paper that you're about to release on public service advertising. Is there a website?
There is. Actually, thank you. I said it was released today, but I just checked. It's tomorrow. Okay. And you can find that at Public Library of Science 1. So it's PLOS1.org, PLOSONE.org. And it's open access, so anyone can get it for free. And you can dig into it and see what we did.
Very cool. Do you have any sort of specific suggestions for storytellers out there based on your understanding of the neuroscience of narrative? I mean, I'm a writer, I'm a filmmaker, I'm out there trying to make a story, and I want to make it more powerful. How would you advise me?
I think it's really coming from, that's a great question, and I don't have all the answers, but here's some general guidelines. One is to, again, think about this as human scale. So I think sometimes, particularly for filmmakers, there's this sort of kind of godlike view that directors may have in which, I'm moving these pieces around, where I think novelists and particularly fiction writers think of, inhabiting this world and letting the characters find their own way. Somehow a muse speaks to you, but having that kind of ground up view where these characters are fully developed and they have emotions, they have fears and worries, is a wonderful way to bring people into the story. And as I said earlier, we like being transported into other people's worlds. It's a key part of being, gregariously social creatures like we are as human beings. So allow the viewer or the reader that pleasure of getting into this other world. Let them be in the same world that you have created in your film or in your ad or in your novel. And again, that means, I think, letting them feel the pain, letting them enjoy the joy, suffer with them, feel what they feel. And the more you can do that, again, you can't overwhelm, you can't spend 20 minutes talking about, the splinter in my toe. But, to the extent that you can actually bring in these real emotions, you start to feel what they're feeling. So we discussed yesterday, James Bond's movies. So, for James Bond movies, when he jumps across the moving train and doesn't get killed, we generally get this sweat response, right? We are as stressed out. That's not true. We are having a stress response that's mimicking the stress response we imagine him having. But in actuality, right, this is an actor who jumped across a green screen, who, and they filled in with CGI something later. So, nevertheless, we like that experience, right? We like to be this sort of vicarious partners in these characters. To the extent that we can give you these opportunities to have that experience in a novel, in a movie, in an ad, that experience is more rewarding. So I think that's one of the punchlines that we've got is allow those characters to develop. So, practical example. Many of us have read books, and then you go see the movie, and the movie is not as good. And the movie's not as good because it's compressed, and often it's because the character is not fully developed. So the characters are doing things, but I'm not hooked into why they're doing them, and I start to disengage. So I'm not getting the sweat response when James Bond jumps over. I'm not, I don't know what he's doing. So once you have those sensory responses, but the second is also to have the sense of purpose. So even though it's fun to get these twists and turns, as I said earlier, what you also want to know is making sure you're foreshadowing why this person's doing this in the story. And having some confusion in the beginning is fine, but if I just see a person wandering around doing nothing, then I've lost the point of why I'm following them. And for me, I've seen many movies in which there is sort of inability to kind of follow them. And this can be done certainly in a nonlinear and way that grows tangent. I think one of the great movies ever filmed is Memento, this movie of a man who loses his ability to form long-term memories, and there's a murder, his wife is murdered or something, and the movie runs in reverse. I'm sorry, I've ruined it for everyone who hasn't seen it. Great movie, go on Netflix, go get it. It runs in reverse, but it has the same dramatic arc structure. If you look at that movie carefully, even though it has starts and stops, because this guy can't remember what he's doing, it still has that same building tension, and you get more and more sucked into how much this guy is suffering, and that he's suffering for some reason, and we're getting little pieces of what that reason is, and you really want to resolve that. in your own mind, but you want him to resolve it. So the story is interesting because we want to find out really what happened, why he's suffering so much, why he's working so hard and risking his life to do the things he's doing, given his neurologic impairment. So it still has that same classic story structure. So I think if you can do it in reverse, everyone else should be able to do it going forward, right? Easier said than done, says Frank.
Yeah, one of the things that I find most intriguing about entertainment in the past 20, 30 years is how much more complicated TV shows and movies have gotten. TV in particular, I mean, it used to be, back in the 60s and 70s, everything was completely episodic. And, after 60 minutes, the story was wrapped up and you went on to a new story the next week. Then with Hill Street Blues in the 80s, I believe, you began to get these sort of, longer narrative story arcs that went over a number of episodes. And now you have something like, Downton Abbey, which, becomes extremely complicated and, or Lost, for example. These stories that become extremely complicated and carry on for, in some cases, years. Do you have any thoughts about, why we are, either able to or want to, deal with increasingly complicated stories like that?
It's a great question. Maybe the group can help me out. I don't have off the top of my head, have a sense, other than perhaps, this is pure speculation, not based on any research we've done, but perhaps the 30-minute, 60-minute format where everything is resolved neatly, we've explored that fully, and so we're looking for these additional approaches. It's also a great way to keep you going. So I know when I write, I think about every section break, every chapter break, there's a hook in there, right? I have to give you a reason to turn to the next page. And so I think by expanding that 60-minute format to a whole series where the characters are developing and, storylines are picked up across different episodes weekly, is a very rich way to keep you engaged in the storyline. So you still get resolution from that week's episode, but at the same time you want to see for this longer narrative, will they survive? Will they find their lost parents? I think it's giving it digestible chunks, but at the same time giving you the promise, the anticipation of something to follow. And so in the brain, anticipation is also very rewarding. So we anticipate anything pleasurable. We get the same kind of brain response you get from taking cocaine or methamphetamine. I mean, it's a very powerful thing that says, you need to focus on this. This is really cool. This is important for you.
Right. That actually leads to another thing I'm quite curious about, which is, obviously one of the key molecules, so to speak, in terms of focusing our attention is, there have been, quite a number of studies on this, and I'm curious about the relationship of dopamine to oxytocin. How those sort of interact. Do you have any sense of that?
Oh, what a great question! Thanks for letting me do a little neuroscience, practical neuroscience. Don't worry. So we've actually characterized this larger brain circuit that makes us feel empathy, which I call the home circuit. Home stands for human oxytocin-mediated empathy circuit. So it starts with the release of oxytocin. So I see Charlie, he gives me a hug, I release oxytocin, and what we've done in the human brain, what evolution has done in the human brain, is it hooked in the release of oxytocin to the activation of this larger brain circuit, which causes the release of dopamine and serotonin. And so this dopamine response says essentially, whatever Charlie just did to you, that's what the humans apparently like, because he's smiling now, and so you should keep doing this. And the second is the serotonin response, which has this kind of mood-lifting effect. And so this whole circuit is reinforcing engagement, essentially, with others. And I think that's why we want to have, these stories that have developing tension and releasing tension. The problem is, particularly this dopamine circuit, it's very fickle. It doesn't respond if things are predictable. So you want to have some unpredictability in here. And at the same time, you want to sort of have clear ending points and pickup points. So this storyline is developing, and I'll hold some tension here. I'll have another pickup point. Oh, now my dopamine activates again. Here's some more tension. I'll have another pickup line. But now this line is going to start bothering me because I haven't resolved the tension. So I need to bring that over and release the tension. And so this kind of, I think this is working out. This is the optimal, I think storytelling is the workout for the brain, right? So I'm going to work out my biceps, and then when I exhaust them, I'm going to move and work out another muscle group, right? I may go back and do the biceps, but I can't keep doing the biceps forever because it's just there's a fatigue. And so neurons, brain cells themselves get fatigued, and they need a reset. So think of this as doing some sets and then getting a little reset, do some other sets, do a reset. And so this is the way we kind of optimally engage ourselves. Otherwise, we do get fatigued. And if there's not enough things to get excited about, then I'll sort of flatten out, and the story becomes too predictable, too easy, not exciting enough. So yeah, so having something unusual happen, I think is very important.
So it's sort of a dance in between oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine.
It is, yeah, exactly right. And so that dance, to the brain's perspective, is quite enjoyable. And so, this is, I'm sure you do this, Frank, when you write, but I always try little sections out on my poor dear friends who suffer, and just see if it resonates, or write a piece and put it on a blog and see how it resonates. So for me, as a non-professional writer trying to work in a professional realm, blogs are a great way to get impact. So just, here's this, 500 words, and see how people respond to it, and then I can start tweaking that. Oh, that one worked, and this one didn't work, and so I think we have these wonderful tools now where we can do market tests. And something Charlie brought up earlier was, once we're in the future of storytelling, where I have not just words, but I have video, I have this kind of potentially sensory experiences, right? The bigger the bandwidth of this story, eventually the more compelling it is. And of course, the downside, as we all know, is I can have all kinds of technical, really great stuff and have a flat story that doesn't engage me. So I think still the narrative is the key aspect to this, but to the extent that I can build in additional sensory hooks, go to the website and do this, have the audio book, have nice voice narrating it, have all kinds of other ways to experience this story, I think it gets to be much richer and therefore more compelling.
I have a question about it. I was thinking about neuromarketing, which is a branch of marketing that studies how our brain can be changed or understood in order to offer products or these kind of things. And as these technologies of reading people and the brain evolve, we are seeing that people themselves that sometimes don't know what to do or why they do things, but neuroscience do know. So my concern here is, as we manage to create more and more this kind of technology, cannot it be a little bit in the edge of being ethical or not? How you manage to manipulate people or not? You can do wonderful things, as you said. You can really improve your relationship, your emotions, and good things. But also you can, in a way, manipulate also when you understand what people want, even when they don't know it themselves.
I mean, that's a deep question, right? Thank you, Martha. Great question. As I said earlier, we still, the final decision that we make for a purchase or, of a good or service still comes from the front of the brain, this highly developed human area we call executive area that kind of controls our behavior. And so even though we're getting these unconscious signals all the time, the cute salesperson, the smells of the store, the music, and at some level I should be able to modulate all those to a greater or lesser extent across individuals. It is difficult to kind of be prudent, right, when there are so many ads trying to induce us not to be prudent, to be, to spend money like crazy, to be impulsive. So I think one way to do that from the consumer's perspective is to slow things down. So even though, I may really want to buy Frank's book, I may wait a couple hours before I do it, or this new car that I want, or whatever. If I slow down the decision, then I let these cognitive parts actually kick in. So again, from a societal perspective, it may mean, we want to put, a sort of, if these ads get so good, we may want to have a sort of holding period where, you click the button, I'm going to purchase this thing, but then you wait for 2 hours and you get to change your mind. So we can actually think of putting in some feedback loops in which, we can slow down this process. Having said that, there's no mind reading. For the work we've done with Bill Casepier's project, we can actually predict with 90% plus accuracy after you watch this little ad about this father and son who has cancer, whether you'll donate money to it. 90% is almost scary good. We don't know if we can do that for a broader set of ads, but we do know for this one it's so well designed and produced that it just nails it. So
yeah,
but we sort of like that, right? So it's this is helping childhood cancer. By the way, in our experiments, we always really donate the money. We don't keep the money. We actually donate the money to some too. So we're the good behavior guys, the ethical guys. We don't.
Yeah, of course. But I'm thinking about not only ads and clicking, but when you see a story, I don't know if you have seen a movie called The Joneses, where a family plays a role where they inspire people to buy. So it connects with people's brains in terms of telling a story that makes you want to do what that people do yet, what they buy, what they live, and this kind of thing. So it's broader than just ads or clicking buttons. So this is my concern when we think about neuromarketing. We really can know about people more than they know about themselves in this sense. So.
I think that's a very good question. I think that's true for all of neuroscience. In some sense, we don't know ourselves because 99% of what the brain does is unconscious, because consciousness is a very expensive process to run. It's an expensive program to run in your brain. Having said that, there's this irreducible randomness, and it feels like free will, and we could debate whether that's true or not, but it certainly feels that way. And I don't think we're going to have manipulation. And if it gets to the point where we are manipulating people, then I think there is a role for things like regulation. But from the sort of pure storytelling perspective, we sort of want to be manipulated, right? So I want to be James Bond when I watch that movie, right? That's why I'm going to the movie. I have this underlying, I wish I was a hero, right? I wish I could jump over trains and kill the bad guys. Or I want to have this wonderfully loving emotional experience that the couple in the dramatic movie are having. So I think it is something that we want, but you're right. If we push it over into my behavior is changing and therefore I'm doing things that are maladaptive for me, that's a bit of a problem.
Thank you.
Well, I wanted to thank everyone for coming and joining us today. It's in the tradition of a good story. We're going to cut it off here when we want more. And I know I could stay and talk all day with you, Paul. So thank you, really, and thanks to all of you who've joined us. This was a fascinating conversation and so valuable, at least for me, as a storyteller. So again, Paul, it's really a pleasure, and a big hug to you.
Big hug to you, Barry. See you soon, I hope. And thanks to Frank and Martha for coming on. How great that was.
Thank you.
And we'll hopefully see you all in October 3rd and 4th at Future Storytelling this fall. So thanks again, and we'll speak to you soon. Have a good day now.
Bye, Charlie.
Bye.